They're not important at all. They're 1 out of 100 people. So slavery is more important than it's ever been, but individual slaves matter less to me. And therefore it is easier to mistreat them and to do things, to keep it the way I want it to be. And so that's what this is saying, is that once you get more and more slavery, you actually treat the slaves worse. That's what history taught us. Again, that's one of the things that I don't think you would have predicted. I don't think that the Europeans would have predicted that. But we know that's exactly what happened. And we can see that in the United States when the South needs more slavery because of the crops and the climate. And they go to far greater lengths to hold on to them. They're willing to do things that Northerners aren't. Northerners, who ultimately don't really need that much slavery, they pretty much just walk away from it, turn away from it. Doesn't mean they're not racist. It just means they go, it's not my problem, I don't have to deal with that. We see lots of racism in northern cities well into the 20th century. But it's not the same kind, it's not the violent version of it. It's an ignoring part of it. This is one of the things that Martin King Jr. points out. Because in the South, yes, there's a lot of horrible things that go on, but you can't ignore each other in the South. In the North, African Americans just locked away in their own part of town and ignored it. So if they're starving to death, nobody pays attention to them. So it's a different version of this, but it's all still there. So again, more extensive, the more you need it, the more sophisticated, the more rules you make about it, the more determined you are to keep it, the worse you actually treat people. So just some basic ideas here of what happened, and I'm going to flip the page on this map. The process of getting slaves to the Americas is called the Middle Passage. It is the Middle Passage of the triangular trade. There are actually quite a few triangles, but the classic one is the blue triangle here. So raw products come out of the Americas, crops, lumber, things like that, go to Europe where they're converted into manufactured goods. Those goods are then brought down the coast of Africa. By the way, most slaves do come from this part of Africa, not North Africa, not South Africa, not East Africa. Most African Americans will be able to trace their heritage to this part of Africa, whether that is the Senegambia region, Senegal and Gambia, or the Congo region. It's right through here. Then from there, slaves and gold are brought over to the Americas, where those slaves are used to grow the crops that go over here, and that's the triangle. And there's some other triangles, but that's the classic one. The middle part, the crossing the Atlantic part, is called the Middle Passage. It's called the Middle Passage. Europeans typically don't go in and round up the slaves in the interior. They would much rather just pay the Africans to do that themselves. That's the business model. So you can see this painting here, the Europeans are just hanging out and watching all the chaos go on. And you can go to West Africa today and still see the prison / kind of castle forts that were there, that were used in to hold the slaves. If you think about bringing slaves, it's not unlike the cattle drives. On a cattle drive, you take as many cattle as you can because you know you're going to lose some along the way. So the more you take, the more you'll have at the end, the more money you'll make. It's not worth it to go to Africa and bring a few slaves back to America. It's way too expensive to make that journey. So you need to cram as many as you can. And this is actually a diagram made by slave traders about how to maximize your space. So each of these is a human body. So how do we maximize the floor space of this slave deck? And you can see what we do. What do you do when you get here to the bow of the ship and you kind of got a triangle up? You put them in at a T with 2 45-degree angles. They can fill in that space. They actually build decks as well that are just for the slaves. So it's the length of a human body and it's the height of a person. One of the things they recognize is that you take up about this much space when you lay on your back. You take up this much space when you lay on your side. So let's do that, like sardines. Let's put them in there together. This is awful. Okay, this is the worst thing anybody can imagine. They're crossing the Atlantic Ocean along the tropical regions. It is well over 100 degrees in there most of the time. They absolutely die at alarming rates. They get sick and die. Often, maybe you're taking with your entire village. Maybe you're the only person in here who even speaks your language. So it just is a mix of those sort of things. You can imagine that the people aboard slave ships are not the best kind of people. This is something when I grow up I want to be. Okay, the most famous one of these is the guy who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. So I'm going to read the lyrics of Amazing Grace and think about this, the guy who shipped slaves from Africa to America. And what is he talking about? A wretch like me. I'm the worst person in the world. Why? Because I did something that was awful. Okay, and ultimately, I'm sure from that. So women are raped. People are thrown off as they dive. There is so much human stuff coming off of these ships that sharks will just follow them from Africa all the way to the Americas because there's constant chunk in the water. So we can't even imagine the horrors that this is. It's so bad that 20% simply die getting to America. If you survived the trip and you came as a part of a village or part of your family, and now you are connected, you've made it, you're linked up to a trade center. You can see on this map, the thicker the arrow, the more slaves that come through. So the number one slave port is Charleston, South Carolina, with a few others going up there. But the majority of slaves that come into what is now the U.S. come through Charleston, because that is the place where you need the most slaves. On this map, you can see the thickness of the arrow, that the amount who come to North America is actually the smallest. Now, we fixate on that part because it's U.S. history. But in reality, the vast majority of the slaves went to someplace other than what is now the United States. Typically the Caribbean and Brazil. So if you think about the populations of those areas, you'll see a lot higher African ancestry. Think about baseball players from the Caribbean, speak Spanish and yet clearly have African ancestry. In the United States, that isn't the case. In South Carolina, it's about half the population. In New Hampshire, it's going to be 1% of the population. So it just, the farther south you go, the better the crops are that you can grow, that need more workers, the more slavery you're going to have. So you make it here, you are literally put up on an auction block and sold. So if you did come with your family, this is probably the end of that. Most people who are coming to buy a slave can afford one slave. So if you're sold to somebody who's going to move you to North Carolina, and your wife is sold to somebody who's going to move the herd to Georgia, that's the end of that. You're never going to see them again. And one of the arguments, in fact, about why slaves didn't really rebel at the beginning is it's quite possible that they don't actually speak the same language as the other slaves, and there's no real way of forming unity there. And by the time they get around to it, slavery is their life expectancy. Remember, being brought to America from Africa, your life expectancy is 7 years. Within 7 years of being brought, you're likely to die. However, if you have kids that were born here, their life expectancy is going to be up around 30. So that's kind of the point that you're getting to. For the English colonies, it might be better to bring your slaves in from the Caribbean instead of directly from Africa. It's shorter, which makes it cheaper. And if you're buying them from places like Jamaica, the English sugar colony, then they already speak English. So that's probably a better investment for people in the United States, is to buy directly from English areas rather than directly from Africa. This is a poster for a slave auction from 1769. So it says, Charleston, to be sold on Thursday, the 3rd day of August, a cargo of 94 prime, healthy Negroes. What else do we define as prime in the United States? Meat. This is a livestock auction. Okay, the prime, they're healthy. We're going to strip them naked, and you're going to be able to see for yourself, can they handle the work? And then look how they're listed, consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls, just arrived at Brigantine Dimia, Francis Barmaster from Sierra Leone. That's another one of the countries there in West Africa. Why would they list men first? If you can only afford one slave, and most slave owners will ever only own one slave, you want the one who's the best worker, that's a man. Why would you list boys second?
There's potential.
So remember, if life expectancy is only about 30, men are going to probably leave your workforce pretty quickly. Either they become physically unable to perform, or they simply pass away. So if I really only need one slave and I have a man, but I buy a boy for the cheap, by the time the man is dead or can't work anymore, maybe the boy will be a man and we can transition that way. Okay? And then enlist women ahead of girls. Why would they do that?
They can have those.
If you're buying women to have children. And women are able to give birth. Girls are not yet ready to give birth. So, as a guy who owns cattle, this is exactly how you do the cattle industry. What stage are we in? Okay, do we need cows to have calves right now? Or we have some cows that are aging out, and so we'll buy some heifers very cheap, and then a year or two they'll be ready to be cows, and we'll get rid of the older cows. That's exactly what's going on here. By the Civil War, the number one industry in America is the buying and selling of slaves. Not cotton, not railroads, not factories. What masters will realize by the Civil War is it is a better business for me to be in not to own slaves to pick my cotton, but to own slaves to sell slaves. sell the extra, that's the best way for me to make money. So they are literally breeding farms for slavery. That's what they're going to figure out as time goes by. Again, most of the slaves did not come to North America. They went elsewhere in the Americas. There's really only one company that's allowed to bring in slaves from Africa to the British North America, and they have they're called the Royal African Company, they have a monopoly, and when that's the case, there's no real interest for you to make a bunch of trips, because the more supply you produce, the lower the price is. So if you're the only one who can sell, you might as well just take your sweet time, bring however you want to. They lost the monopoly at the end of the 1600s, and now the competition says, get as many slaves as you can. Bring in as many people as you possibly can. So what numbers are we looking at? Well, 25,000 are there by 1700. Roughly about 10% of the non-Indian population of the colonies. By the American Revolution, that number is up to about 20%. In the first ever U.S. Census, there are 4 million Americans. There are 700,000 slaves. So that's roughly about a fourth or a fifth of the population. By 1763, that number has jumped to 250,000. So there is an explosion in the number of slaves. 16,000 of those are New England, so that is the farthest northern colonies. They do have slavery. Okay, no reason to pretend they don't. All the colonies have slavery at some point. These will be the first states to get rid of slavery because they don't really have that much of it. They don't really need it that much, but they still have it. Benjamin Franklin owned slaves. Benjamin Franklin made money on his newspaper advertising runaway slave things. Middle colonies, that includes Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. And then the rest of the South is everything else, and that's 205,000. So the vast majority of the slaves are in the South. Now remember, that's a South that is not yet Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, the rest of the Deep South. It ends in Georgia. I'll just mention very quickly that the French also have slavery. They have their own set of rules called the Code Noir, and in their system, they actually treat the slaves differently than the English. They're guaranteed more rights in their system. So the Code Noir says that if you own slaves, you're supposed to actually convert them to Christianity. If you have children by slaves, you're supposed to actually treat